The dust of Dry Creek tasted of grit and failed prayers. Coulter Dawson felt it coat his throat, a familiar bitterness that did little to wash away the foulness of the last 3 days spent tracking rustlers through the godforsaken canyons. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Flint, plodded down the town's single. Sorry excuse for a main street, its head low with fatigue. Coulter's own weariness was a deeper thing, settled into his bones like a winter chill that no summer sun could ever fully thaw. He was a man carved from the hard angles of the West, his face a map of long miles and harsh weather, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. The lines around them weren't from laughter. They were from squinting into the sun, from staring into the dark, from the constant, vigilant watch he had kept over nothing and no one for 5 long years. Dry Creek was like a dozen other towns he'd passed through, a handful of clapboard buildings leaning on each other for support, a saloon that bled noise and desperation into the street, and a general store whose windows were clouded with the same dust that covered everything else. But something was different here. A current of unease ran beneath the surface, a furtive quality to the way men gathered in small, tight knots, their voices dropping to low murmurs when he rode past. He'd heard the whispers for months, from one end of the territory to the other, rumors of men taking advantage of the hard times, of droughts and plagues that left women widowed, orphaned, and destitute. Whispers of secret sales, of women being paraded like livestock for men with enough coin to buy themselves a wife, a bedmate, or a slave. He had dismissed it at first as ugly campfire talk, the kind of filth that lonely men spew into the darkness, but the stories grew more frequent, more detailed. They spoke of a circuit, of auctioneers who moved from one desperate town to the next, preying on the weak, cloaking their vile trade in the guise of charity. Coulter felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It was the same brand of soulless greed that had taken his Mary Ann from him, the casual cruelty of men who saw others not as people, but as property. He swung down from Flint in front of the saloon, the ache in his back a dull throb. He needed a whiskey, something to cut through the trail dust and the even thicker dust of his thoughts. But as he looped the reins around the hitching post, he saw it. A crudely painted sign propped against the side of a large barn behind the saloon. It read, Dry Creek Widow and Orphan Relief Society, Charity Auction and Supper. A lie. He knew it with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a knife's edge. He saw the men sidling toward the barn, not the usual collection of cowhands and drifters, but ranchers with heavy pockets, shopkeepers with shifty eyes, men whose faces held a greedy, expectant sheen. There were no women with them, no families coming to offer support. Just men slinking toward the barn door like coyotes drawn to the scent of a fresh kill. He left Flint tied to the rail and moved toward the barn, his step slow and deliberate, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap liquor, and something else, the metallic tang of fear. He slipped through a gap in the warped wooden planks at the side of the building, his eyes adjusting to the dim, lantern-lit interior. The place was packed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder on the dirt floor, their faces upturned toward a makeshift stage at the far end. A portly man with a waxed mustache and a gaudy waistcoat stood on the stage, his voice a smooth, oily river of words. Coulter's stomach churned. It was an auction, just as the rumors had said. He saw a woman huddled on a bench near the stage, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had just been sold. The man who had bought her, a burly rancher with a triumphant leer on his face, was already moving to claim his prize. And now, gentlemen. The auctioneer boomed, his voice echoing in the tense silence. A truly special offering, a flower of the plains, tragically orphaned, left with naught but the clothes on her back and a spirit as pure as the driven snow. Brought to us by the good graces of circumstance, in need of a guiding hand, a strong protector. 2 rough-looking men pushed another figure toward the stage. It was a girl, hardly a woman. She stumbled, her bare feet scuffing the dirt-packed floor. Her dress, a simple calico, was torn at the shoulder, revealing a pale, trembling sliver of skin. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was a tangled mess, but it was her face that snared Coulter's breath in his throat. It was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, but her chin was held high. Her eyes, wide and terrified, still held a spark of furious, unyielding pride. She looked out at the sea of leering faces, not like a lamb to the slaughter, but like a cornered wolf, ready to fight to the last. "This is Elsie Warren," the auctioneer announced, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Her father, a good man, passed on 6 months ago. No kin to speak of, no land to her name, a blank slate. Gentlemen, ready for a new beginning. She is strong, healthy, and has never known a man. A true innocent." The crowd murmured. A low, predatory sound. Men shifted their weight, their eyes crawling over her, stripping her bare with their stares. Elsie flinched as if physically struck, her hands clenching into small, white-knuckled fists at her sides. She was trembling, a fine, violent shudder that shook her entire frame, but she did not cry out. She met their gazes one by one, her own filled with a contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. Coulter felt a rage build within him, a white-hot inferno that burned away his weariness. He saw Marianne's face superimposed over the girl's, the same terror, the same defiance. He saw the leering faces of the outlaws who had ambushed them on the trail, their eyes filled with the same ugly hunger, the promise he had made to himself 5 years ago, the vow to never get involved, to never take another soul under his protection, turned to ash in his mouth. "Let's start the bidding at $20, the auctioneer declared. "A paltry sum for such a treasure. Do I hear 20? A hand went up. 20! 30 from Mr. Keene over there, a man of taste." Boone Keene, the same rancher who had bought the first woman, grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. Elsie's eyes locked on him, and a flicker of raw panic finally broke through her composure. 40! Someone shouted from the back. 50! Keene countered immediately, his eyes fixed on Elsie, possessive and cruel. Coulter moved. He didn't think, he simply acted. He pushed through the press of bodies, a phantom of righteous fury. Men grunted and cursed as he shoved them aside, but no one tried to stop him. There was something in his eyes, a look of cold, deadly purpose that gave them pause. He reached the edge of the stage as the bidding hit $70. Elsie saw him then. Her defiant eyes met his, and in them, he saw a flicker of disbelief, a desperate, drowning plea. $100. Coulter's voice cut through the air, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. The barn fell silent. All eyes turned to him. The auctioneer squinted, a frown creasing his fleshy face. 100 from the stranger. A bold bid, sir. A very bold bid. Boone Keene scowled. 110. 200, Coulter said, his voice level, his gaze never leaving the auctioneer. A gasp went through the crowd. This was more than the price of a good horse. Keene's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to bid again, but Coulter didn't give him the chance. In one fluid motion, he drew his Colt. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the sudden stillness. He leveled the barrel not at Keene, but directly at the auctioneer's chest. "The auction is over," Coulter said, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the barn. "This young lady is leaving with me." The auctioneer's face went pale. "Now, see here, friend, there's no need for—" "I am not your friend." Coulter cut him off. "And if you say another word, it will be your last." For a heart-stopping second, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. Boone Keene lunged for his own pistol, but Coulter was faster. He didn't even look at Keene, he just fired from the hip. The shot wasn't meant to kill, but to maim. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Keen's thigh, and the big rancher went down with a roar of pain and outrage. Men scattered, scrambling for cover, knocking over lanterns and benches in their panic. Coulter vaulted onto the stage, grabbing Elsie's arm. Her skin was ice cold. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrifying hope. "Come on," he grunted, pulling her toward the back of the stage. He kicked open a flimsy door that led out into the night. Gunshots exploded behind them, splintering the wood of the doorframe. He shoved Elsie ahead of him and fired 2 shots back into the barn without aiming, just enough to keep their heads down. They were in the alley behind the saloon. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky. He half-dragged, half-carried her toward the main street where Flint was still tied. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice rough. She just nodded, her throat working, unable to speak. He untied the reins with one hand, his gun still in the other. He swung himself into the saddle, then reached down and hauled her up behind him. She was lighter than a sack of flour. Her arms went around his waist, her hands clutching his shirt in a death grip. He spurred Flint into a gallop, and they thundered out of Dry Creek, leaving the shouts, the gunshots, and the stench of that vile barn behind them. He didn't look back. He just rode, pushing the horse hard, heading for the dark, anonymous safety of the open plains, the trembling girl clinging to his back like a ghost. They rode for hours, the rhythmic drumming of Flint's hooves the only sound in the vast, silent darkness. The moon offered little light, but Coulter knew the land. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the ground beneath the horse, by the faint outline of the distant mesas against the star-dusted sky. The girl behind him was utterly still, so quiet he wondered if she was even breathing, but he could feel the frantic, terrified thumping of her heart against his back. When he judged they were far enough away, he finally slowed Flint to a walk, letting the lathered horse catch its breath. He found a small, sheltered arroyo, a deep scar in the earth that would hide them in the light of a fire from any distant eyes. He dismounted, his legs stiff, and then reached up to help Elsie down. Her body was rigid, and when her feet touched the ground, her legs buckled. He caught her, his hands closing on her upper arms to steady her. She felt fragile enough to break. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. "You're safe now." She pulled away from his grasp as if burned, stumbling backward until she hit the wall of the arroyo, where she slid to the ground. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small, a study in misery. Coulter said nothing more. He unsaddled Flint, rubbing the tired animal down with a handful of dry grass before hobbling him nearby. He worked with an economy of motion, his actions practiced and sure. He gathered dry brush and within minutes had a small, smokeless fire crackling to life. The flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting flickering shadows against the dirt walls around them. He pulled a strip of jerky and a biscuit from his saddlebags and held them out to her. "You should eat something." She shook her head, her face turned away from him, hidden in the shadows. "I can't." He didn't press her. He set the food on a flat rock near her and retreated to the other side of the fire, giving her space. He ate his own meager meal slowly, his eyes constantly scanning the rim of the arroyo, his ears straining for any sound that was out of place. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind. He took off his heavy duster, the one that smelled of dust, leather, and horse. He walked over and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She flinched at his closeness, but didn't shrug the coat off. It swallowed her small frame, a gesture of warmth and protection she seemed too stunned to either accept or reject. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice low. "I'll keep watch." He settled back against his saddle on the other side of the fire, his rifle resting across his lap. He watched her, a huddled shape wrapped in his coat, her face still hidden. The firelight danced in her disheveled hair, turning the strands to threads of gold and copper. He saw the slow, steady rise and fall of her shoulders, and thought maybe she had drifted off. But then, her voice, small and brittle, cut through the quiet. "What do you want for me?" The question was so soft he almost didn't hear it. It wasn't defiant. It was defeated. The question of a person who had been taught that nothing, especially kindness, ever came for free. It was the question of property. Coulter stared into the flames, the heat doing nothing to warm the cold dread that her words stirred in him. He thought of the men in the barn, of their smug, possessive faces. He thought of Boone Keene's triumphant leer. They all knew what they wanted from her. Their desires were simple, ugly, and honest in their own profane way. He, on the other hand, had no answer. He had acted on pure, blind instinct, a reflex against an old and festering wound. He had saved her. Yes, but he had no idea what to do with her now. To take her to another town would be to risk the same thing happening all over again. To leave her was to condemn her. He was tied to her now, by a single act of violence. He saw Marianne's face in the flames. She was laughing, her head thrown back, the sun catching in her blonde hair. They were riding toward the land he'd bought, the small plot in the foothills where they were going to build their life. A cabin, a few head of cattle, children, a future. The memory was so clear, so painful. It was like a fresh cut. Then the image shifted. The laughter was gone, replaced by a look of confusion, then terror, the sudden ambush, the crack of rifles from the rocks above. He remembered the jolt of the bullet hitting his own shoulder, the searing pain, but worse, much worse. He remembered her scream, a sound that was cut short. He remembered holding her, the warmth of her blood soaking through his shirt, her eyes, once so full of life, going vacant and still. He had sworn over her cooling body that he would never again be responsible for someone else's life. He would never again offer his protection, his heart, to anyone. It was a promise sealed in blood and grief. And now this girl, this child, was asking what he wanted from her. He looked across the fire at her. She had turned her head and was watching him, her eyes huge and dark in the flickering light, waiting for his answer, waiting for him to name his price. He was silent for a long time, the weight of his past and the uncertainty of their future pressing down on him. Finally, he found his voice. "Nothing," he said, the word raspy in his throat. He cleared it and spoke again, more firmly. "Nothing you're not ready to give." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, confusion, maybe disbelief. She held his gaze for another moment, searching his face for the lie, for the hidden meaning behind the words. Then, as if the effort was too much, she pulled his coat tighter around herself, turned away, and curled into a small ball, facing the cold dirt wall of the arroyo. Coulter kept his watch, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the fire. Sometime later, in the deepest part of the night, he heard a sound, a tiny, choked sob she tried to smother against her arm. He knew she was dreaming, reliving the horror of the auction block, the feeling of all those eyes on her, pricing her, owning her. His first instinct was to go to her, to offer some kind of comfort, but he stopped himself. What comfort could he offer? He was a stranger, a man who had brought more violence into her life, even in the name of saving it. To comfort her might only frighten her more. So he sat still, his jaw tight, and pretended not to hear her cry. It was the only kindness he knew how to give. When the first pale light of dawn bruised the eastern sky, she was still asleep, or pretending to be. He rose quietly, saddled Flint, and kicked dirt over the dying embers of the fire. He gently touched her shoulder. "It's time to go." She scrambled to her feet, her movements stiff and wary, shrugging off his coat and holding it out to him. Her eyes were shadowed, her face pale and drawn. She looked everywhere but at him. He took the coat and motioned toward the horse. They rode in silence as the sun climbed, painting the landscape in harsh shades of ochre and rust. They were heading west, toward the distant, hazy blue line of the Sierra Nevada mountains, toward his remote cabin. the one he had built for a life that had been stolen from him. It was the only place he could think to take her, the only place that felt safe, a sanctuary and a prison all in one. He didn't know what would happen when they got there. He only knew that for now. They had to keep moving. He could feel her behind him, a tense, silent presence, a life he now held in his hands, and the weight of it was heavier than any mountain. The last leg of the journey was a punishing climb into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and the sharp, cold smell of distant stone. Coulter's cabin was not what Elsie had imagined. There were no images in her mind of a cozy homestead, only a vague and formless dread of what her new cage might look like. What she found was something else entirely. It was a structure of stark, lonely beauty, built of hand-hewn logs that fit together with a craftsman's precision. It stood in a small clearing, backed by a dense wall of ponderosa pines, its single stone chimney rising like a silent watchtower. It was a house built for a life that had not happened. Inside, the feeling of absence was even stronger. The main room was spare and scrupulously clean. A stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a few shelves holding tins and sacks of flour. It was a man's space, functional and devoid of softness. Coulter dropped his saddlebags on the floor with a heavy thud. "There is another room," he said, his voice flat as he gestured toward a closed door. "You can have it." He walked over and opened the door, letting a sliver of light fall into the small space within. It held a simple bed frame with a neatly folded quilt, a small washstand, and a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. It was as spare as the rest of the cabin, but somehow it felt different. It felt expectant, as if it had been waiting. Elsie stood frozen in the doorway, clutching the bundle of her tattered dress. This was it, the room where he expected her to earn her keep. The dread she had suppressed for days rose in her throat, thick and suffocating. Coulter seemed to read the fear in her posture. He did not enter the room, but turned and walked to a large trunk sitting against the wall in the main room. The hinges groaned as he lifted the heavy lid. A faint scent of lavender and cedar drifted out. He reached inside and pulled out a dress of simple, blue-sprigged cotton, neatly folded. He held it out to her. "This should fit," he said, his voice quiet, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "It's clean." Elsie stared at the dress. It was not new, but it was lovingly cared for. The fabric was soft, the stitches fine. A woman's dress. She looked from the dress to the closed door of the bedroom, and a terrible understanding dawned on her. This room, this dress, they had belonged to someone else. She was a ghost stepping into a life that had already been lived and lost. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Taking the dress felt like a profound trespass, yet to refuse it felt impossible. Her own clothes were barely rags, a constant reminder of her humiliation. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the dress from him. The fabric was cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave a curt nod, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "There is water in the basin. I will be outside." He turned and left, closing the main door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the crushing silence of the cabin. For the first 2 days, they moved around each other like wary animals. Elsie stayed mostly in her room, the blue dress a borrowed skin that felt both comforting and strange. Coulter gave her space, never crowding her, never speaking unless necessary. He chopped wood, tended to his horse, and disappeared for hours at a time, checking his trap lines or simply walking the perimeter of his land. The silence was a language all its own. In it, Elsie began to feel not trapped, but strangely unseen. For the first time since her father's death, no one was looking at her with pity, or hunger, or contempt. She was simply there. On the 3rd day, a restless energy began to stir in her. She could not bear to be idle. To be a useless mouth he had to feed. It felt too much like being kept, so, tentatively, she began to help. She started by sweeping the floor of the main room with a crude broom she found by the hearth. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. When Coulter returned, he glanced at the clean-swept floor but said nothing. The next morning, she rose before him and fetched a bucket of fresh water from the creek that ran behind the cabin. She found the coffee tin and had a pot brewing over the fire by the time he came in from the cold. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, she was terrified she had overstepped. He simply walked to the hearth, poured himself a cup, and then, after a moment's hesitation, poured one for her, setting it on the table without a word. Her small acts of service became a routine. She would feed Flint an apple in the morning, her hand trembling at first as the horse's soft lips whiskered against her palm. She learned where the vegetables were kept in the small root cellar and began chopping them for their supper, her knife strokes clumsy at first, then more confident. She was not a skilled cook, but she could make a passable stew. He never asked her to do any of it. He never thanked her either. He simply accepted her contributions, and in his acceptance, she found a sliver of purpose. She was not his property, not his prisoner. She was helping, and in that small, fragile distinction, she began to find her footing. A week after their arrival, their supplies ran low. Coulter announced he was riding into Pine Ridge, the nearest town, a half-day's ride down the mountain. He told her to bolt the door behind him and not open it for anyone. The thought of being left alone was terrifying, but the thought of going with him, of facing people and their questions, was worse. Coulter rode into Pine Ridge feeling a familiar tension settle in his shoulders. Towns meant people, and people meant trouble. He tied Flint outside the general store and stepped inside, the little bell over the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that was at odds with his mood. The store owner, Silas Croft, a weasel-faced man with spectacles perched on his nose, gave him a knowing smirk. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Heard you left Dry Creek in a hurry, Dawson. Heard you took some of the charity with you." Coulter's jaw tightened. He ignored the jibe and began listing what he needed: flour, coffee, salt, cartridges for his rifle. As Silas measured out the flour, he leaned conspiratorially over the counter. "So," he said, his voice a greasy whisper, "the girl, she's settling in all right? Keeping you warm on these cold mountain nights? I imagine she's working off her debt right gratefully." He winked, a sly, ugly little gesture that made Coulter's vision go red at the edges. The memory of the auction, of the leering faces, of Elsie's terror, slammed into him. He saw Silas's face merge with the auctioneer's, with Boone Keene's, the same entitled, possessive smirk. His hand clenched into a fist, and for a split second, he was going to launch himself over the counter and smash that smirk off Silas's face. He could feel the phantom impact in his knuckles, the satisfaction of it, but he stopped himself. A brawl would only bring the sheriff, would only bring more questions they couldn't afford. He reined in the rage, letting it settle into a cold, hard knot in his gut. He leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You say one more word about her, Silas, and I will tear this store apart with my bare hands, starting with you." Silas's smirk vanished. He paled and took a hasty step back, suddenly very busy with a sack of beans. No offense meant, "Coulter, just town talk." Coulter paid for his supplies in grim silence and left, the shopkeeper's words clinging to him like filth. The ride back to the cabin was long, his thoughts dark and churning. He had saved her from the auction, but he could not save her from the tongues of men like Silas, from a world that would always see her as damaged goods. When he got back, Elsie was waiting by the door, a worried line creasing her brow. She must have seen the thunder on his face. He stalked past her, dropping the sacks on the table with more force than necessary. "What happened?" she asked, her voice small. "Nothing," he bit out. "Just town gossip." But she would not be put off. She followed him as he began to unpack the supplies, her gaze steady and searching. "What kind of gossip?" she pressed. "About me?" He stopped, his back to her. He didn't want to tell her, didn't want to put that poison in her ears, but he had promised himself he wouldn't lie to her. "The shopkeeper," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her intuition sharp as a razor. "He said something about how I was paying you back, didn't he? For saving me." Coulter turned slowly to face her. The pride she had worn like armor on the auction block was gone, replaced by a raw, painful vulnerability. Her question was the same one she had asked by the campfire, but this time it was not defeated. It was an accusation. "Is that what this is?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "Am I just waiting for you to decide the time is right to collect your payment?" His own anger drained away, replaced by a deep, weary ache. He looked at her, at this girl-woman who had been so thoroughly broken by the world, and he felt the walls around his own heart crack just a little. "I told you once before," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I expect nothing you are not ready to give. I expect no more than respect and truth. That is all." The simple conviction in his words seemed to disarm her. Her defiant posture softened, and her shoulders slumped. The fire in her eyes was doused by a wave of shame. I have not been truthful with you," she stammered, looking down at her hands. He waited, giving her the silence she needed. "At the auction," she began, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear. "The man said I had no kin. That was a lie. I have an uncle, my father's brother. When my father died, the land, our farm, it all went to him. He came to the house and told me I could stay on, as a helper for his wife." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "His wife had been dead for 10 years. I knew what he meant. I refused. So he turned me out. He kept the land, the house, everything. He told me a pretty girl like me would find a way to make a living. He told me I was no better than a whore anyway." The confession came out in a rush, a torrent of shame and betrayal. She finally looked up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I was so scared they would find out at the auction, scared they would think that my uncle was right." Coulter listened, the story settling like a stone in his gut. The cruelty of it, the casual betrayal by her own blood, was almost worse than the auction. He understood now the source of her fierce, brittle pride, and the deep well of her shame. He felt an unfamiliar urge to share something of his own, to meet her painful truth with one of his own. "Pain comes in all shapes," he said, his voice low. He walked over to the hearth and stared into the low flames. "This cabin, this land, I did not build it for myself. I built it for the woman I was going to marry." He paused, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Her name was Mary Ann. We were ambushed on the trail 5 years ago. Robbers. They killed her. I was supposed to protect her." He did not turn to look at Elsie. He could not. The admission hung in the air between them, a ghost made of words. He had never spoken of it to another living soul. They stood there for a long time, on opposite sides of the room, enveloped in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of their shared histories. Two wounded people, huddled around the small fire of a fragile, unspoken understanding. Meanwhile, miles away, Boone Keene sat in a leather chair at his sprawling ranch, his bandaged thigh throbbing with a dull, insistent rhythm that matched the pounding in his head. The humiliation of being shot and disarmed in front of 24 men was a far deeper wound than the hole in his leg. He had been made a fool of by some no-account drifter. And the girl had been his. He had won the bid, fair and square in his mind. The drifter hadn't bought her. He had stolen her. She was his property. He took a long swallow of whiskey, the fiery liquid doing little to bank the rage simmering in his belly. He would find them. He did not care how long it took or how much it cost. He would find them. and he would take back what was his, and the cowboy, Dawson, would pay a much higher price than $100. A few days later, while Coulter was out hunting, Elsie was cleaning the small room she now thought of as hers. She ran a dust cloth over the small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. It was the one piece of furniture she had not touched. It felt too personal. But today, driven by a restless curiosity, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among folded linens, was a small, leather-bound book and a silver-backed hairbrush, and beneath them, a small, oval portrait in a tarnished silver frame. She picked it up. It was a photograph of a young woman, her hair swept up in soft curls, a gentle smile on her lips. Her eyes were bright and full of a happy, confident light. She was beautiful. This had to be her, Mary Ann. A complex and bitter cocktail of emotions churned inside Elsie. She felt a profound guilt, as if she were a thief, living in this dead woman's room, wearing her dress, eating at her table. A wave of jealousy, sharp and ugly, washed over her. This woman had been loved, truly and completely. Coulter had built a life for her. What was Elsie in comparison? A stray, a piece of damaged property he had rescued out of pity. She could never compete with the perfect, smiling ghost in the silver frame. She would never be enough. She placed the portrait carefully back in the chest and closed the lid. But the image was burned into her mind. That night, the weight of it all became too much to bear. Her gratitude to Coulter, her fear of being a burden, her hopeless jealousy of a dead woman, it all twisted into a single, desperate idea. She had nothing to offer him, nothing to give him that would ever equal what he had done for her. Nothing, except the one thing the men at the auction had wanted, the one thing her uncle had accused her of selling. She waited until the cabin was dark and quiet, until the only sound was the low murmur of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. She rose from her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slipped out of her room and into the main room, where Coulter slept in a bedroll near the hearth. He was a dark shape in the firelight. She knelt beside him. "Coulter," she whispered. He was awake in an instant, his hand reaching for the gun that was always beside him. He relaxed when he saw it was her. "What is it? What's wrong?" She could not meet his eyes. She stared at her hands, which she had knotted in the fabric of her nightgown. "I want to thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "For what you did, for everything. I have nothing to give you, no money, nothing. But I can pay my debt, if you want me to." She began to untie the ribbon of her nightgown, her fingers clumsy and trembling. The meaning of her offer was unmistakable. It was not born of desire or affection, but of pure, heartbreaking gratitude and a desperate need to feel she had some value. Coulter's hand closed gently over hers, stopping her. His touch was warm and firm, not possessive, not demanding, just stilling. He looked at her, and in the dim firelight, she saw not desire in his eyes, but a deep, profound sadness. "Elsie," he said, his voice incredibly soft, "don't give yourself away just to feel safe." His words were a gentle refusal, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was not rejecting her body. He was affirming her soul. He was telling her she was worth more than that. The concept was so foreign, so contrary to everything she had come to believe about herself, that she could not process it. She pulled her hand away and scrambled to her feet, a hot wave of shame washing over her. She fled back to her room without a word, slamming the door behind her. Outside, a low rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains. A moment later, the first drops of rain began to patter against the roof. She threw herself onto her bed and buried her face in her pillow. The rain began to fall harder, a steady, relentless drumming that matched the storm inside her. And for the first time since he had pulled her from that barn, Elsie Warren cried. She cried for her father, for her lost home, for the uncle who had betrayed her, for the beautiful, smiling woman in the photograph. and she cried because a stranger had shown her a kindness so profound she did not know how to bear it. The rain came without warning, a sudden, violent deluge that turned the world outside the cabin into a churning gray blur. What began as a patter on the roof became a roar, a relentless assault that hammered against the sturdy logs and streamed down the single glass window pane in murky rivers. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to split the very mountains, and the wind howled through the pines like a ravenous beast. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them in the small cabin as surely as if the door had been barred from the outside. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the main room. The air grew thick with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and the unspoken tension that shimmered between them. They moved with a careful, deliberate slowness, each acutely aware of the other's presence in the confined space. A dropped spoon sounded like a gunshot. A shared glance across the table was fraught with 1,000 unsaid words. Elsie's shame from the night she had offered herself to him, and his gentle refusal, had built a new, more complicated wall between them. It was a wall of awkwardness and a strange, burgeoning intimacy that neither of them knew how to navigate. Coulter spent hours staring into the fire, his face grim, his thoughts a dark, swirling storm that mirrored the one outside. He was trapped not just with her, but with the feelings she stirred in him, a protective instinct so fierce it terrified him, and a tenderness he had thought long buried with Marianne. Elsie, for her part, tried to keep busy. She mended a tear in one of his shirts with the neat, tiny stitches, her needle a small point of focus in the overwhelming chaos. She kneaded dough for bread, the physical work a welcome outlet for her restless energy. But there was no escaping the oppressive closeness, the feeling of being held in a state of suspended animation while the world raged. On the second night, the storm reached its zenith. A blinding flash of lightning lit the cabin in a stark, blue-white glare, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so violent the floorboards shuddered. And then, darkness. The single lantern they had burning on the table flickered once and died, its chimney cracked by the vibration. The only light left was the sullen red glow of the embers in the hearth. The sudden, profound darkness was a physical presence. Elsie let out a small, involuntary gasp. She could not see Coulter, but she could feel him, could hear the soft rustle of his clothes as he moved. "Stay put." His voice came out of the blackness, calm and steady. "I will get another lantern." But in that moment, cloaked by the anonymity of the dark, something in Elsie broke. The fear, the shame, the relentless feeling of being an object to be appraised and bartered for. It all came pouring out, a quiet, desperate torrent. "I am afraid," she whispered into the darkness, the words torn from a place deep inside her. "I am afraid that no one will ever want me, not for me, that I will only ever be something to be bought." Her voice was thin and trembling, the confession of a soul that had been stripped of its own value. She heard Coulter stop moving. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper even than the darkness. She expected him to say something, to offer a hollow reassurance, or, worse, to ignore her completely. But he remained silent, simply listening, his quiet presence a vessel for her pain. Encouraged by his silence, by the safety of the dark, she continued. "It was not just my uncle. After my father died, he tried before. When I was 16, a man came through, a trader with a string of mules. He had silver on his saddle and a look in his eye that made my skin crawl. My uncle brought him to the house for supper. I heard them talking later, in the barn. My uncle, he was telling the man how strong I was, what a good worker I would be. He was describing me like one of our milk cows." She was shaking now, the memory as vivid and violating as if it had happened yesterday. "I ran away. That night, I took a loaf of bread and a blanket, and I just ran into the hills. I was gone for 3 days. I nearly starved. When I finally came back, my father was half mad with worry. He never knew why I had run. I never told him. I could not bear for him to know what his own brother had tried to do." She took a ragged breath. "The traitor was gone, but I never forgot. My uncle never touched me. That man never laid a hand on me. But I felt like they had taken something, like my soul was not my own anymore, like it had a price on it." She fell silent, her confession hanging in the pitch-black air. She felt utterly exposed, as if she had peeled back her skin and shown him the deepest, ugliest scars she possessed. She waited for his judgment, for his disgust. Instead, she heard the scrape of a match. A small flame bloomed, and in its fragile light, she saw his face. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity. There was only a deep, quiet understanding, and a sorrow that seemed to echo her own. He lit a new lantern, and its steady, golden glow pushed back the oppressive darkness. He did not speak. He did not have to. In his silence, she felt heard. The next morning, the storm had broken. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, and the world outside was washed clean, dripping and glistening. The emotional storm inside the cabin had also passed, leaving behind a fragile calm. Elsie woke feeling hollowed out, but lighter. She sat by the fire, trying to comb the tangles from her long hair with her fingers. The damp, confined air had left it a hopeless mess. She tugged at a particularly stubborn knot, wincing in frustration. Coulter watched her from across the room. He rose, walked to the chest that had belonged to Marianne, and took out the silver-backed hairbrush. He held it out to her. "Here," he said. She stared at the brush, then at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. It felt like another trespass, another ghost she would be disturbing, but there was something in his expression, a simple, unadorned offer of help, that made her reach for it. Her fingers were clumsy, and she fumbled with the knots, her frustration growing. "Let me," he said, his voice quiet. She froze, her heart starting to hammer. She turned her back to him, a silent, terrified act of assent. It was the most profound gesture of trust she was capable of making. She felt him move behind her, felt the warmth of his body close to hers, though he was careful not to touch her. He took the brush from her nerveless fingers. His movements were surprisingly gentle. He started at the ends, working through the tangles with a slow, patient deliberation. Each stroke of the brush was methodical, careful, and utterly devoid of anything but a simple, focused desire to help. It was not the touch of a lover or a master, but of a caregiver. It was a touch that asked for nothing. Elsie sat rigid at first, every muscle tensed, waiting for something more, for a hand on her shoulder, for a shift in his breathing. But it never came. He just brushed her hair, the rhythmic strokes a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. Slowly, impossibly, she began to relax. She closed her eyes, letting the simple, non-sexual intimacy of the moment wash over her. It was a language without words, an act of pure, uncomplicated kindness that spoke more loudly than any reassurance he could have offered. He was seeing her not as a woman to be desired, but as a person in need of care. And in that moment, a tiny, fragile seed of trust began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. While a fragile peace settled in the mountain cabin, a storm of a different kind was brewing in Dry Creek. Boone Keene, his leg healing but his pride still festering, rode back into town with two of his toughest ranch hands. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Lucas Brandt was a man whose ambition had long ago outpaced his morals. He had a thin mustache and eyes that were always calculating, always assessing what a man was worth and how he could be used. He was the secret architect of the auctions, a silent partner who provided the protection of the law for a hefty share of the profits. Coulter Dawson's violent intervention had not only cost him money, it had threatened to expose his entire lucrative enterprise. Keene threw a heavy pouch of coins onto Brandt's desk. It landed with a satisfying thud. "I want the girl back, Brandt," Keene said, his voice a low growl. And I want the man who took her. Brant eyed the pouch, a slow smile spreading across his thin lips. What you want, Mr. Keene, is justice. It seems to me your property was stolen. Abducted, Keene snarled, right out from under my nose. An abduction, then, Brant amended smoothly. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. A clear violation of the law. I will issue a warrant for this Coulter Dawson. Abduction of property. Horse thieving is a hanging offense. I see no reason this should be any different. We'll put a price on his head. $200. That should get every bounty man from here to the border interested. Just get me the girl, Keene said, his eyes glinting with a cruel, possessive light. You can have what is left of the man. The wanted poster went up the next day. It was nailed to the notice board outside the sheriff's office, the crude drawing of Coulter's face bearing only a passing resemblance to him. But the name was clear, and the crime, abduction of property, was a chilling declaration that Elsie Warren was not considered a person, but a thing. A day later, an old trapper named Jedediah, who had run a line with Coulter years ago, saw the poster. He knew Brant was as crooked as a dog's hind leg, and knew immediately that the charge was a lie. Under the cover of darkness, he saddled his mule and began the long, hard ride up into the foothills. He arrived at Coulter's cabin just after dawn, his mule wheezing with exhaustion. Coulter met him at the door, his rifle held loosely in his hand. "Brant's put a price on your head." "Coulter," Jedediah said without preamble, handing him a worn copy of the wanted poster. $200, says you abducted property." Coulter's face went hard as granite as he read the words. He looked over at Elsie, who was standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. He had brought the law down on them, or rather, a twisted, corrupt version of it. He was a wanted man, and she was the property he had stolen. He thanked Jedediah, gave him fresh water and coffee, and sent him on his way with a warning to be careful. After the old trapper was gone, a heavy, grim silence fell over the cabin. Coulter began to pace, his mind racing. They could not stay here. Brant and Keene would tear the mountains apart looking for them. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere they would never think to look. He spent the rest of the day in a state of grim preparation. He cleaned his guns, packed ammunition, and sorted through his supplies, creating 2 light packs, ready for travel. Elsie watched him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He was planning something, and he was not including her in the plans. That evening, she found him by the fire, studying a worn map of the territory. He was tracing a route south, his finger moving down past the settlements, across the empty deserts, toward the border, toward Mexico. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was not planning for them to escape. He was planning for her to escape. He was going to send her away. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. He looked up, startled, his face etched with weariness. "I am finding you a way out of this," he said. "There is a mission south of the border, San Sebastian. The priests there take in people who need help. You will be safe there. I can give you enough money to get started." His words, meant to be reassuring, were like stones pelting her. Safe. He was talking about sending her away, alone, to a foreign country, and calling it safety, just as she had started to feel a flicker of security, a fragile sense of belonging. He was planning to cast her out. All her old fears of abandonment came rushing back, a bitter, choking tide. "You are running from me," she accused, her voice trembling with a sudden, fierce anger. "You are not protecting me. You are getting rid of me. Am I so much trouble? Am I such a burden that you have to send me 1,000 miles away?" "That is not it," he said, his voice tight. "This is not about you being a burden." "Then what is it about?" she cried, taking a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "Why can you not look at me? Why can you not just Be with me. Is it because of her, the woman in the picture? Am I not good enough to stand in her shadow? Stop it, Elsie, he warned, his voice a low growl. No, I will not stop. You saved me from that barn. But you are just as trapped as I am. Are you not? You are a ghost, living in a house you built for a dead woman. And you are afraid of me. His control finally snapped. He shot to his feet, his face a mask of raw anguish. Yes, he roared, the word exploding out of him. Yes, I am afraid. Are you happy now? I'm afraid of losing someone again. I'm afraid of watching the light go out of their eyes while I stand there, helpless. And I am afraid of loving someone who sees herself as broken, because I do not know how to fix myself, let alone anyone else. The raw, painful truth of his confession hung in the air between them, vibrating with all the grief and fear he had kept locked inside for 5 years. The anger drained out of Elsie, replaced by a wave of heart-wrenching empathy. She saw him then, not as a stoic, unbreachable fortress, but as a man as wounded and lost as she was. She closed the distance between them, her movements driven by an instinct she did not understand. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, his skin rough with stubble beneath her palms. His eyes, stormy and filled with pain, stared down into hers. And then she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was raw, desperate, and clumsy, a collision of two lonely, frightened souls. It was a kiss born of shared pain and a terrifying, unspoken hope. His arms came around her, pulling her against him with a bruising force, as if he were afraid she might disappear. He kissed her back, a release of all the pent-up loneliness, all the grief, all the fear. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow. For a moment, they clung to each other, two drowning people holding onto the only other wreckage in a vast, empty sea. But then, just as the kiss deepened, just as the desperation began to smolder into something else, Elsie pulled away. She rested her forehead against his chest, her breathing ragged. Her own fear and his had met and recognized each other, but she knew, with a sudden, unshakable clarity, that this was not the answer. To lose herself in him now would be to trade one cage for another. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and resolute. "I am not ready," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I will be." She took a small step back, creating a space between them that was no longer a chasm of fear, but a boundary of self-respect. "I will be, when I am mine again." The kiss left a phantom imprint on the air between them, a memory of desperation and a promise of a future that was not yet earned. The morning after was quiet, steeped in a fragile new awareness. They moved around the small cabin with a shared awkwardness, the unspoken confession of his fear and her declaration of self-possession having changed the very geography of their relationship. Coulter's gaze would sometimes linger on her for a moment too long, a question in his eyes he did not know how to ask. Elsie, in turn, found herself watching his hands, remembering their gentleness in her hair, their strength as they pulled her close. An uneasy truce had settled. His plan to send her to Mexico was abandoned, unspokenly erased by the rawness of their confrontation. But the threat that had prompted it remained, a shadow lurking just beyond the clearing. They were living on borrowed time. They both knew it. To break the tension, and because their supplies were dwindling again, Coulter announced he was going hunting. "We need meat," he said, his tone practical, businesslike. "I will not be long. Stay close to the cabin. Keep the door bolted." Elsie nodded, her throat tight. "Be careful," she whispered. He gave a single sharp nod and was gone, the heavy rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his figure disappearing into the dense stand of pines. The silence he left behind was profound, amplifying every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind. Elsie tried to busy herself, scrubbing the rough-hewn table until her knuckles were raw, but a prickling sense of unease settled over her. She felt exposed, a solitary figure in a vast, indifferent wilderness. She was in the small barn, forking fresh hay for Flint. When she heard it, it was not the sound of a single rider, but the dull, rhythmic crunch of several horses moving at a deliberate walk. Her blood ran cold. It was not Coulter's approach. He was always quiet, a ghost in the trees. This was different. This was an arrival. Panic seized her. She scrambled up the rickety ladder into the hayloft, burrowing into the loose, sweet-smelling hay, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She peered through a crack between two wallboards, her breath held tight in her chest. Two men rode into the clearing. The first was large and brutish, his legs stiff as he swung down from his horse. Boone Keene. His face was a mask of smug, vengeful triumph. The second man was thinner, with a weasel's narrow face and a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Brandt. He dismounted with a fluid, predatory grace. "He is not here," Brandt observed, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Just as your source said." "The girl will be," Keene growled, his gaze fixing on the barn. "She will not have strayed far. Find her." Elsie shrank back from the crack, pressing herself deeper into the hay. She prayed she was invisible, that she could melt into the shadows and dust. She heard them enter the cabin, the heavy thud of their boots on the floorboards, their voices muffled but clear. They were ransacking the place, a drawer scraping open, a chair being overturned. Then, silence. "Check the barn," Brandt's voice commanded. Closer now. The barn door creaked open. Sunlight streamed in, carrying with it a cloud of dust motes. Elsie held her breath until her lungs burned. She could hear them moving below. Keene grunting with effort, Brandt's steps light and purposeful. "Nothing down here," Keene said, his voice laced with impatience. He kicked at a wooden bucket, sending it clattering across the floor. Then, a floorboard directly above him creaked under Elsie's slight weight. It was the barest whisper of a sound, but in the tense silence, it was a thunderclap. Brandt looked up. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, what have we here? A little mouse in the rafters." It was over. There was nowhere left to run. Keene let out a roar of triumph and started up the ladder. Elsie scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. His big, meaty hand closed around her ankle, and he dragged her, kicking and scratching, from her hiding place. He hauled her down the ladder and threw her onto the dirt floor. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. Before she could recover, they were on her. Brandt produced a length of rope, and while Keene held her down with a knee pressed brutally into her back, the sheriff bound her wrists together, the rough hemp biting into her skin. They dragged her to her feet and shoved her onto a low stool. They stood over her, two vultures looming over their prey. "So this is the little seductress who has caused so much trouble," Brandt said, his voice a silky, menacing purr. He circled her slowly, leading a good man astray, persuading him to steal property that did not belong to him. "She is mine," Keene spat, his face inches from hers. His breath was sour with whiskey. "I paid for her. You belong to me." "I belong to no one," Elsie choked out, her voice shaking but defiant. Keene laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You will learn. You had a soft bed up here, did you not? A warm fire. I wonder how you earned it." He reached out, his thick fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was reptilian, and a wave of revulsion so powerful it was nauseating washed over her. "I think it is time you started paying your real owner." Every instinct in her screamed, the memory of the auction, the feeling of being stripped bare by 100 hungry eyes, the terror of her uncle's betrayal. It all coalesced into a single, explosive point of pure, unadulterated rage. She turned her head and spat directly in his face. The glob of spittle struck his cheek. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Keene's face, already flushed with anger, turned a mottled, furious purple. He wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, his eyes narrowing to glittering slits of hatred. He drew back his hand to strike her. A single gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet whizzed past Keen's ear, close enough to make him yelp and stumble back. It thudded into the barn wall, a neat, dark hole in the wood. Both men spun around. Coulter stood at the entrance to the barn, framed by the bright morning sun. He was no longer the quiet, grieving man of the cabin. He was a specter of vengeance, his face a mask of cold, deadly fury, his rifle leveled and steady in his hands. "Get away from her," he said. His voice was unnaturally quiet, but it carried an edge of such lethal promise that it cut through the air like a razor. Brant, ever the opportunist, reacted first. He drew his pistol and fired, but his shot was hurried and wide. Coulter did not even flinch. He fired the rifle from his hip. The shot caught Brant in the shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of pain. The sheriff dropped his gun, clutching his arm, and staggered back, his face a mask of shock and agony. Keen, roaring with rage, drew his own weapon, but Coulter was already moving, dropping the rifle and drawing his Colt in a single, fluid motion. The world seemed to slow down. 2 shots rang out. So close together they sounded like one. Keen's shot went wild, burying itself in the hayloft above. Coulter's was true. It struck Boone Keen squarely in the chest. The big man's eyes went wide with a look of profound surprise. A dark stain blossomed on the front of his shirt. He looked down at it, then back up at Coulter, a confused, uncomprehending expression on his face. He took one stumbling step forward, then his legs gave out, and he crashed to the floor, the life gone from him before he hit the dirt. Seeing his advantage, Brant scrambled out a side door, clutching his bleeding shoulder and disappearing into the trees. Coulter let him go. His attention was fixed entirely on the small, trembling figure huddled on the stool. The barn was suddenly, unnaturally silent. The only sounds the frantic thumping of Elsie's own heart and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Coulter holstered his pistol and walked slowly toward her. He knelt, his face a maelstrom of emotions, rage, relief, and a terrible, gut-wrenching guilt. He pulled a knife from his belt and sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, she collapsed. She did not fall toward him, but inward, curling into a tight ball on the floor, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. She wrapped her arms around her head as if to ward off a blow. "Elsie," he said softly, his voice ragged. She did not seem to hear him. She just rocked back and forth, a low, wounded sound coming from her throat. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and she flinched away with a terrified cry. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He had killed a man to save her, but his violence was just one more terror layered on top of all the others. He sat on the dirt floor a few feet away from her, giving her space, his heart breaking with every tremor that racked her body. He waited. He waited for what felt like an eternity, until the violent shaking began to subside into a fine, steady trembling. Finally, she lifted her head. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide and vacant with trauma. She looked at the body of Boone Keen, then at Coulter, then at the severed ropes lying on the floor. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, then another. Soon, a torrent of silent, agonizing tears streamed down her face. She looked at him, her gaze filled with a bottomless, heartbreaking despair. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Why do they always want me in chains?" The question was not for him. It was for the world, for a God she no longer believed in. It was the cry of a soul that had been relentlessly hunted, claimed, and commodified. He had no answer for her. There were no words that could heal a wound so deep. So he did the only thing he could. He moved slowly, deliberately, and gathered her into his arms. This time, she did not flinch. She collapsed against him, her body limp and heavy, and she began to sob. It was not the quiet, hidden weeping of the past, but a storm of grief, a raw, animal wail of pain and terror and rage that seemed to be torn from the very center of her being. He held her. He held her as the sun climbed high in the sky and began its slow descent. He held her as the shadows in the barn grew long. He held her through the hours, his own body aching, his shirt soaked with her tears. He just held her, a silent, solid presence in the wreckage of her world, offering the only comfort he had. He was not letting go. That night, the cabin was a place of ghosts. The body of Boone Keene was gone, dragged into the woods and buried in an unmarked grave. But his presence and the violence of his death lingered. Elsie had not spoken a word since her breakdown in the barn. She moved like a sleepwalker, her eyes shadowed and distant. Coulter built up the fire, the crackling flames a small defiance against the encroaching darkness. He made a simple broth, but she refused it. She sat on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. Finally, long after the moon had risen, she stood up. She looked at him, her gaze direct for the first time in hours. "I want to sleep in my own skin tonight," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He did not understand at first. Then she began to undress. It was not a seduction. It was a ritual. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost trance-like. She took off the blue-sprigged cotton dress, the one that had belonged to Mary Ann, and folded it neatly. She unwrapped the bindings on her feet. She stood before the fire in nothing but her thin chemise, her skin glowing in the firelight. She was not offering her body. She was reclaiming it. She was shedding the skin of the victim, the property, the borrowed identity. Coulter watched her, his heart aching with a feeling so powerful he could not name it. He understood what she was doing, and he knew, with absolute certainty, how he had to respond. He rose and went to his own bedroll. He took the blankets and furs and began to build another bed on the floor, on the other side of the hearth from her own pallet. A separate bed, but close enough to guard her. He worked in silence, and when he was finished, he lay down on his own bed, fully clothed. He lay there, watching her. She lay down on her pallet, turning on her side to face him. She did not touch him. He did not touch her. He just lay there, a silent sentinel, watching the soft, steady rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, a quiet guardian of her first night of freedom in her own skin. The next morning, she was different. The haunted, vacant look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a new, steely resolve. She met his gaze over their morning coffee. "I want you to teach me how to shoot," she said. There was no plea in her voice. It was a demand. He simply nodded. He took her out into the clearing and gave her his rifle. It was heavy and awkward in her hands. He stood behind her, his voice low and patient as he showed her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His hands corrected her stance, his touch impersonal and instructive. She was clumsy at first. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet from the tin can he had set on a stump. The recoil bruised her shoulder and made her cry out, but she did not give up. She set her jaw, reloaded, and tried again. And again. She was clumsy, but she was determined. Later that day, as they sat by the fire, mending a piece of tack, she asked the question he had been both dreading and expecting. "Tell me what happened to her," she said softly. "To Mary Ann. Tell me everything." And so he did. He told her about their plans, about the small plot of land and the dream of a future. He told her about the ambush, the sudden, shocking violence. He described the feeling of helplessness as he lay wounded, unable to reach her, unable to stop them. He spoke of his grief, a raw, hollow thing that had consumed him for 5 years. He spoke, and she listened, her hands still in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. When he was finished, the cabin was silent. A single tear rolled down her cheek. But she was not weeping for herself. She reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his. She wept for him, and in that shared moment of grief, for the outlaw's bride and the auctioneer's victim, something new and fragile began to grow between them. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm established itself. They worked side by side. They spoke of the future, not in grand terms, but in small, tangible plans. "This fence needs mending," Coulter said one afternoon, pointing to the rickety corral. "We could plant corn in that lower field next spring," Elsie suggested, her eyes on a patch of sun-drenched earth. "I always thought an apple orchard would do well on that slope," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, an old dream given new breath. They were not just words. They were the first stones of a new foundation. They were fencing and growing corn and planting an orchard. They were building something that looked a little like a future together. The fragile piece they had built was as delicate as a spider's web, a thing of quiet beauty that could be destroyed by a single careless breath. For a week, they lived within its tenuous threads. They mended the corral fence, their hands sometimes brushing, sending a jolt of awareness through them both. They cleared a patch of ground for a spring garden, their labor a silent prayer for a future they did not dare speak of aloud. In these small, shared acts, a life was taking shape, a life that felt real and solid under their feet. It was in the midst of this budding hope, on a bright, cold afternoon while they were measuring the space for the apple trees, that their borrowed time ran out. The sound came first, a low thrumming that was not the wind, but the beat of many hooves on hard-packed earth. Coulter heard it an instant before Elsie did. He straightened up, his hand shading his eyes, his body going unnaturally still. Elsie saw the look on his face, and her heart turned to ice. A line of riders was emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing. There were at least a dozen of them, a grim procession that was not a friendly visit. At their head was Sheriff Brandt, his arm in a sling, his face a pinched, hateful mask. "Inside," Coulter said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now!" They scrambled back to the cabin, the idyllic plans for an orchard dissolving into the thin mountain air. Coulter slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the thick wooden bar into place. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the shutter. The posse fanned out, surrounding the cabin in a loose, confident circle. They were a mix of hard-faced men with the look of hired guns and a few familiar faces from town, men whose greed or fear had aligned them with the sheriff. "Coulter Dawson," Brandt's voice rang out, thin and reedy but filled with the false bravado of the law. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for abduction and the murder of Boone Keene. Come out with your hands empty, and you will not be harmed." Coulter let out a short, mirthless laugh. "His word is worth less than the dust on my boots." He turned from the window, his rifle already in his hands. He looked at Elsie, who stood frozen in the center of the room, her face ashen. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice gentle but firm. "Stay away from the window." "Dawson, I am a patient man," Brandt shouted again. "But these men with me are less so. I am offering you a chance, a deal. Send out the girl, and you can ride away from here a free man. No charges, no pursuit. My quarrel is with the property you stole, not with you." The offer hung in the air, a final, calculated insult designed to sever the bond between them, to reduce her once more to a piece of chattel. Coulter's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at Elsie, and in her eyes, he saw not the terror he expected, but a flash of white-hot fire. He strode to the door and lifted the heavy bar. Before Elsie could protest, he stepped outside, onto the small porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stood there, a solitary, defiant figure against the backdrop of his home. "She is not property. Brandt." Coulter's voice was calm, but it carried across the clearing with the chilling finality of a death sentence. "And she is not yours to bargain for. My answer is no." Brandt's face contorted with fury. He raised his good hand to give a signal, but before he could, the cabin door opened again. Elsie stepped out and stood beside Coulter. She was holding the second rifle, the one he had been teaching her to use. It was heavy in her hands, but she held it steady, her knuckles white. She looked not at Coulter, but directly at the sheriff, her chin held high. "I am not his," she said, her voice clear and ringing, borrowing Coulter's words and making them her own. Then she turned her gaze on Brandt, her eyes filled with a contempt that stripped him of all his authority. "But I am not yours either." For a heart-stopping moment, the clearing was silent. Then Brandt let out a snarl of pure rage. "Fire!" The world exploded in a cacophony of noise and violence. Splinters flew from the porch rail as a volley of shots ripped through the air. Coulter shoved Elsie back inside, slamming the door just as a bullet buried itself in the thick wood. They threw themselves to the floor as the cabin was peppered with gunfire, the sound a deafening hail of lead against the logs. The siege had begun. The first day was a blur of noise, fear, and adrenaline. They crawled from the window to the door, peering through cracks, returning fire sparingly. Needing to conserve every precious round, the posse kept their distance, content to keep them pinned down, to wear them out. As dusk fell, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the occasional taunt shouted from the tree line. They had little food left, a handful of cold biscuits and a strip of jerky. They ate in the dark, huddled by the cold hearth, not daring to light a lamp that would make them a target. The cabin, once their sanctuary, had become their prison, a wooden tomb surrounded by wolves. "Are you scared?" Elsie whispered into the darkness, her voice small. "Yes," Coulter answered, the admission a raw and honest thing. "Are you?" "I have been scared my whole life," she said, a simple statement of fact. "But this is different. I am not just scared. I am angry." In the darkness, he found her hand. His fingers were calloused and warm, and they wrapped around hers, a small point of connection in the vast, terrifying darkness. That night, they did not speak of dying. They spoke of living. They shared whispered hopes by the faint light of the moon filtering through a chink in the roof. "If we get out of this," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I will plant those apple trees, a whole orchard of them." "I want to see the ocean one day," she confessed, a dream so foreign and impossible it felt safe to say aloud. "I read about it in a book once. Water that goes on forever. Is it real?" "It is real," he said. "I will take you there." They talked for hours, their whispered words building a future, a fragile fantasy to hold against the grim reality that waited with the dawn. They fell asleep huddled together on the floor for warmth, his arm a protective weight around her, the rifles lying between them. The second day was worse. The posse grew impatient. They tried to set fire to the barn, but the wood was still damp from the recent storm, and the flames sputtered and died. They crept closer, using the trees and rocks for cover, their shots more accurate, more deadly. A bullet punched through the shuttered window, ricocheting off the stone fireplace with a high-pitched whine. They were trapped, their options, their ammunition, and their time dwindling with every passing hour. As the sun set on the second day, a profound and heavy despair settled over the cabin. They both knew the night was only a temporary reprieve. The final assault would come with the morning light. They were exhausted, hungry, and down to their last handful of cartridges. Coulter was cleaning the rifles by the faint, flickering light of a single tallow candle, his movements economical and grim. Elsie watched him, her heart aching with a feeling that was equal parts terror and a fierce, protective love. He was going to die. They were both going to die. He would die protecting her, a final, futile act in a life defined by loss. She looked at this man who had saved her, who had shown her a kindness she had never known, who had seen her not as an object but as a person. He had treated her with a respect that had allowed her to start respecting herself. He had given her a gift more precious than her life. He had given her back her own soul, and she could not bear the thought of that soul leaving the world without ever having truly chosen its own path. She rose from the floor and went to him, kneeling in front of him. She took the oily rag and the rifle from his hands, setting them aside. He looked at her, his face etched with exhaustion, a question in his stormy eyes. She did not speak. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was nothing like their first kiss. There was no desperation, no angry desperation. This was a kiss of profound and deliberate tenderness. It was slow and deep and filled with a universe of unspoken things. It was a kiss of gratitude, of acceptance, of a love that had grown in the most desolate of soils. When she finally pulled away, she looked directly into his eyes, her own shining in the candlelight. "I do not want to die without having chosen someone," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Not bought, not sold, not taken, chosen." His breath hitched. He saw in her face not the broken girl from the auction block, but a woman of incredible strength and resolve, a woman who, in the face of death, was claiming her right to love. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, and a single, hot tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime on his face. "Elsie," he whispered, her name a prayer. She led him by the hand to the small pallet of blankets on the floor. There, in the heart of the siege, with death waiting just outside their door, they finally made love. It was an act of breathtaking intimacy, intense and tender all at once. It was a joining of scars, a silent communion of two broken souls finding wholeness in each other. Every touch was a question, and every response an answer. It was a desperate, beautiful act of defiance, a claim that even in the face of annihilation, there was still love, there was still choice, there was still life. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the candlelight, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Elsie traced the line of his jaw with her finger, her touch feather-light. "Now I know," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion as she rested her head on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Now I know what it means to be wanted, not owned." They woke before dawn, not to the sound of gunfire, but to a profound and unnerving silence. They dressed quietly in the gray pre-dawn light, a new, unspoken language passing between them. There was no regret, no awkwardness. There was only a quiet, resolute calm. They were a unit now, bound together by something far stronger than fear. The attack came with the first rays of sun. A fusillade of shots erupted, this time concentrated on the door. They were coming. Elsie took her position at the side of the window, her rifle ready. She saw a flicker of movement near the woodpile, a man trying to use it for cover as he crept toward the cabin's blind side. She did not hesitate. She sighted down the barrel, held her breath, and fired. A cry of pain and surprise rang out from the woodpile. The man staggered back into the open, clutching his leg, and fell. She had not killed him, but she had stopped him. A fierce, wild surge of triumph shot through her. She was not a victim. She was a fighter. The battle raged. The door began to splinter under the concentrated fire. They were down to their last few bullets. Coulter looked at her, his face grim, but filled with a love and pride that made her heart swell. They would die, but they would die together, fighting for the small, precious world they had built. Just as a heavy log came crashing against the door, threatening to break it from its hinges, a new sound split the air, a volley of rifle shots, but not from the men surrounding them. These came from the trees, from the posse's rear. Shouts of confusion and panic erupted from Brandt's men. Coulter scrambled to the window. A grin, the first genuine smile Elsie had ever seen on his face, split his lips. "It is Jedediah," he breathed, "and he brought friends. A half-dozen riders, tough, Grizzled men who looked as if they had been carved from the mountain itself, charged out of the forest, their rifles blazing. They were Coulter's old trail friends, men he had ridden with years ago, summoned by the old trapper. They descended on Brant's disorganized posse like avenging angels. The fight was over in minutes. The hired guns, their loyalty bought only by coin, threw down their weapons or fled into the woods. Brant, in a panic, tried to mount his horse, but a bullet from Jedediah's rifle caught him in his good leg. He went down screaming, a pathetic, wounded animal. His own men, their faces masks of contempt for the coward they had followed, simply stared at him, then turned their backs. One of them picked him up, slinging him over a saddle like a sack of grain, and they rode off, leaving him to whatever justice awaited him down the mountain. In the sudden, ringing silence, Coulter and Elsie stepped out of the wrecked cabin into the morning sun. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. Jedediah and his friends dismounted, their faces grim but relieved. They nodded at Coulter, and then their gazes fell on Elsie. There was no judgment in their eyes, only a quiet respect for the woman who stood beside their friend. A rifle still held firmly in her hands. After the men had gone, promising to take the captured hired guns to the nearest federal marshal and see that the story of Brant's corruption was told, Coulter and Elsie were left alone in the aftermath. They stood amidst the debris of their home, the splintered door and the bullet-scarred logs a testament to the battle they had survived. Coulter turned to her, his face serious, his eyes filled with a deep, vulnerable love. "I love you, Elsie," he said, the words simple, direct, and true. "But you need to know, you are free. What we found here, it was born of violence and fear. I will not hold you to it. You can go anywhere, to a town, to the ocean. I will give you the money. You can build a life for yourself, a life that has nothing to do with this." He was offering her the one thing no one else ever had, a choice, with no strings attached. She listened, her heart full. She looked at the cabin, at the clearing, at the mountains that had been her prison and her sanctuary. She looked at this man who had offered her his protection, and then, more importantly, had offered her freedom. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and sure. "You saved me," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. She met his gaze, and her own was clear and strong. "But I saved myself too, and I want to stay." The seasons turned, melting the memory of the siege into the landscape. Summer came, hot and fierce, baking the earth and filling the air with the drone of insects and the sweet, sticky scent of pine sap. They worked from sunup to sundown, their shared labor a silent conversation, a knitting together of two solitary lives. The bullet scars on the cabin walls were smoothed and patched, the splintered door replaced with a new, sturdier one, hewn from a massive ponderosa. They were not erasing the past, but building over it, creating a new layer of strength and resilience. Elsie blossomed in the unrelenting sun. The pale, haunted girl from the auction block receded, replaced by a woman whose skin was tanned the color of warm honey, whose hands were calloused and capable. She learned the rhythms of the land, the language of the shifting winds and the changing light. She moved with a new confidence, her back straight, her stride sure. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was replaced by a clear, steady light. She learned to use an axe, her small frame surprisingly powerful, the clean thud of the blade biting into wood a satisfying rhythm. Coulter changed too. The hard, chiseled lines of his face seemed to soften. The constant, vigilant tension in his shoulders eased. He had lived for 5 years in a state of perpetual watchfulness, a sentinel guarding an empty tomb. Now, he was simply a man, living on his own land, with a woman whose presence was a quiet, steady warmth beside him. One afternoon, while Elsie was trying to churn butter, her movements awkward and splashy, she ended up with a dollop of cream on the end of her nose. She looked so earnest and frustrated and utterly ridiculous that a sound escaped Coulter's lips that was so unfamiliar it startled them both. It was a laugh, not a short, grim chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh that echoed in the small cabin. Elsie stared at him, her frustration melting away, and then a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, and she began to laugh with him. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, a sound of healing. In late autumn, Jedediah, the old trapper, made his way up to the cabin again, this time not with a warning, but with the news. He sat at their table, sipping the strong coffee Elsie had brewed, his weathered face creased in a grin. "Brant's gone," he announced, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The feds got him. Seems a few of them hired guns decided to talk in exchange for a lighter sentence. Told the whole story. The auctions, the bribes, everything. They say he will not see the light of day for 20 years. Elsie's hand, which had been resting on her coffee cup, tightened. She looked at Coulter, her eyes wide. "What's more," Jedediah continued, taking a hearty bite of the cornbread she had set out, "the whole rotten business has been shut down, from here to Dry Creek. The fear of the law has put an end to it. No more charity auctions." He winked at Elsie. "You and Coulter here. You kicked the hornet's nest so hard the whole thing came crashing down." The news settled over Elsie not with a feeling of triumph, but with a profound, bone-deep relief. It was as if a great, heavy chain that had been wrapped around her soul had finally, irrevocably, been broken. The system that had declared her property was gone. She was, in the eyes of the world, and not just in the confines of this small clearing, truly free. A few weeks later, they needed supplies. The idea of going into Pine Ridge sent a flicker of the old fear through Elsie, but she stamped it out. She would not hide. She would not live her life in the shadows. She insisted on going with him. The ride into town was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than their first desperate flight. It was a comfortable silence. When they rode down the main street, heads turned. The whispers started, a low murmur that followed them like a trail of dust. Women on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to stare, their eyes a mixture of curiosity, pity, and suspicion. Men tipped their hats to Coulter, their gazes sliding sideways to assess her. Elsie felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she met every stare, her chin held high, her expression calm and unreadable. She would not give them the satisfaction of her shame. They went into Silas Croft's general store. The weasel-faced shopkeeper was behind the counter, and when he saw them, a flicker of fear crossed his face. He remembered Coulter's threat. He gave Elsie a wide berth, his eyes skittering away from hers. "Morning, Coulter, ma'am," he mumbled, his voice obsequious. As Elsie was inspecting a bolt of sturdy denim, a woman entered the store, the blacksmith's wife, a stern, hard-working woman named Martha. She gave Elsie a long, measuring look. Elsie braced herself for a slight, a turned shoulder. Instead, Martha gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a greeting of friendship. It was a nod of acknowledgement, a sign of grudging respect. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall of prejudice. But to Elsie, it felt like a monumental victory. They left the town with their supplies, and with the first, fragile tendrils of acceptance. The first snow of winter had just dusted the high peaks when the girl arrived. She stumbled into the clearing like a fawn startled from the brush, thin and ragged, her eyes wide with a terror that was achingly familiar. She could not have been more than 16. Her dress was torn, and her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. She was a ghost of the girl Elsie had been. She saw Coulter first, who was chopping wood, and she froze, ready to bolt. Elsie, who had been coming from the cabin with a bucket, saw the girl and stopped. She set the bucket down slowly, carefully, as if not to startle a wild animal. "It is all right," Elsie said, her voice soft and soothing. "You are safe here. No one will hurt you." The girl stared at her, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. I ran away," she stammered. "My PA, he wanted to marry me off to a man old enough to be my grandfather. A mean man. I would not do it." Elsie's heart clenched with the pain of recognition so sharp it almost took her breath away. She walked slowly toward the girl, her hands open and empty at her sides. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Sarah," the girl whispered. "Well, Sarah," Elsie said, her voice a warm, steady anchor in the girl's sea of fear. "You look hungry and cold. Come inside. We have stew on the fire and a warm bed where you can rest." She did not look at Coulter. She did not ask his permission. She simply acted, her compassion a force as powerful and instinctive as breathing. She reached the girl and gently placed a hand on her arm. The girl flinched, but she did not pull away. Elsie led her, as gently as if she were made of glass, toward the cabin. She took her into the small room, the room that had been Mary Ann's, then her own sanctuary. She was giving this terrified stranger the only thing of value she had, a place of safety. Coulter stood by the woodpile, his axe forgotten in his hand. He watched them go, this strong, compassionate woman leading the broken, frightened girl into the warmth of their home. He saw in that single, selfless act a strength that dwarfed his own. His strength was in his fists, in his guns, in his ability to endure pain. Hers was in her heart, in her ability to absorb pain, her own and others, and transform it into healing. When Elsie came back outside a few moments later, her face was a mixture of sorrow and fierce resolve. Coulter looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound and humbling awe. "You are stronger than me," he said, the words a raw, simple truth. She looked up at him, and her lips curved into a soft, sad smile. She reached out and touched his arm, her small, calloused hand a comfort against his skin. "Only because you carried me first," she answered. They stood there for a long moment, the unsaid love between them a palpable thing in the cold winter air. That evening, after Sarah had eaten her fill and fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep in the small bedroom, Coulter and Elsie sat by the fire. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. He led her outside, into the crisp, cold night. The sky was a vast, inky canvas, splattered with a breathtaking riot of stars. The moon was full, casting a silver, ethereal glow over the snow-dusted clearing. He led her to the small slope where they had been planting their orchard. The ground was cold and hard now, but beneath the frost, the dream of it still lived. He stopped under the bare, skeletal branches of a young pine tree that stood where their first apple tree would one day grow. He turned to face her, his hands still holding hers. He did not have a ring. He did not have pretty, polished words. He had only the truth. "I built this place for a life I lost," he began, his voice low and rough with emotion. "For 5 years, it was a ghost house, filled with nothing but memories. And then you came. You filled it with life. Elsie, you filled me with life." He took a deep breath, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I do not want to just live on this land. I want to build a life on it, with you. I want to plant those apple trees with you, and watch them grow. I want to have children with you, and teach them how to be strong and kind, like their mother. I love you. I want to marry you." Tears welled in her eyes, hot against the cold night air. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. Her entire life, she had been defined by what men wanted from her. Now, this man was asking to build a life with her. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Then a mischievous, defiant spark lit her eyes. "But on 2 conditions." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing on his own lips. "Name them." "First," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I get to wear trousers at the wedding. I will not be trussed up in a corset and lace. I am your partner, not your prize." He let out a soft chuckle. "Done. And second," she continued, her grin widening, "after the preacher says his words, I get to shoot his rifle, to celebrate." He threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing in the still, cold air. It was the sound of a man who was completely, irrevocably in love. "I would expect nothing less," he said. Later that night, they lay in their bed. The fire in the hearth burned down to a warm, red glow. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft breathing of the sleeping girl in the other room and the whisper of the wind outside. Elsie was curled in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. She felt a sense of peace so deep and complete it was almost dreamlike. She thought back to that first terrifying night in the arroyo, a lifetime ago. She thought of the question she had asked him, the question of a desperate, defeated girl who believed she was nothing more than property. "Coulter?" she murmured into the darkness. "I am here," he answered, his voice a sleepy rumble. She lifted her head slightly, so she could see his face in the soft firelight. "That first night," she said, "I asked you once what you wanted for me." A soft, knowing smile touched her lips. "I think I know now." He smiled back at her, a smile of infinite tenderness and love. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her impossibly closer. He knew exactly the moment she was talking about. He had carried her question in his heart all these months. And now, he finally had the answer. Not just for her, but for himself. "Just this," he whispered, his lips brushing against her hair. "You, free, and still choosing me." Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please comment where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your reactions in English.